The frontier had a way of breaking people down. Storms that ripped through the plains, hunger that hollowed a man's ribs, and loneliness that lingered like a shadow too heavy to shake. For the widow cast out by her own kin, survival meant carrying not only her grief, but also the weight of her newborn child against the biting winds of the west. Her steps dragged through the dust, her eyes red from nights without rest, until at last she reached the gates of a ranch known only for the silence of the man who lived within it. A rancher, feared by some, pitied by others, but spoken of as a soul untouched by kindness. It was at his door that desperation found its voice. "Please take us in, sir," she whispered, her arms trembling as she clutched her baby close to her chest. The words hung in the air, fragile yet piercing, breaking through the silence of the lonely homestead. To beg in the Wild West was no small thing. Pride was often the last possession of the broken, but in that moment, pride mattered less than the breath of a child who had no one else to turn to. The plea was not only for shelter, but for a chance at life itself. The rancher, a man whose days were measured by the clinking of spurs and the creak of empty barns, stood frozen in the doorway. For years, he had lived in solitude, building fences higher than his cattle pens, shutting the world out with every nail he drove into wood. Yet here, at the threshold of his silence, stood a woman whose eyes carried both sorrow and fire, whose whisper threatened to tear down walls he thought unbreakable. In her, he saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own forgotten wounds. The baby's cry pierced the stillness, soft yet relentless, pulling at something inside the rancher he had long buried beneath dust and time. It was not the sound of weakness, but of a fragile will to live, the kind that clawed against the wilderness for one more dawn. And in that cry, the rancher heard a truth he could not ignore. The West was cruel enough to swallow a man whole, but it was merciless to a child who had no choice in the matter. That night, the lantern light flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the room as the rancher's hand hovered over the latch. He had been asked for many things in his life: land, cattle, trust, but never something so raw, so simple, and yet so heavy as a plea for mercy. To open that door would mean more than offering shelter. It would mean surrendering the loneliness he had clung to as armor. And as the wind howled across the plains, the question burned hotter than the fire in his hearth. Would he let them in, or let the world outside claim them? The rancher's silence stretched as the widow stood trembling at his door. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling through the shutters, carrying with it the echoes of coyotes crying in the distance. His hand rested on the latch, torn between instinct and hesitation. He had spent years surviving alone, walling himself off from the world, convinced that solitude was safer than hope. Yet in the widow's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own exile, loss, abandonment, and the relentless cruelty of a land that spared no one. Finally, the door creaked open. He stepped aside without a word, and the widow crossed the threshold with her child pressed tightly against her chest. The warmth of the ranch was meager, one fire flickering weakly in the hearth, shadows clinging to the corners. But to her, it felt like salvation. She lowered her head in gratitude, whispering thanks through cracked lips, while the rancher turned away, masking the storm brewing within his chest. For the first time in years, the silence of his home was broken not by the howl of wind, but by the soft cries of a child. The rancher moved about stiffly, bringing water and setting bread upon the table. His hands, calloused from years of work, trembled slightly as he placed the tin cup before her. He avoided her gaze, afraid of what he might see, afraid that her presence would stir feelings he had long buried beneath dust and solitude. The widow drank slowly, her body shaking with exhaustion, her baby nestled against her shoulder. Every detail of the scene, the firelight, the hollow sound of their breathing, etched itself into the walls of his lonely home. Through the quiet, the widow told her story. Cast out by her own family after her husband's death, she had wandered from town to town, each door closing in her face, each refusal driving her deeper into despair. Her baby was all she had left, and she would endure anything to keep the child alive. Her words were not bitter, only weary, carrying the weight of someone who had learned that in the West, mercy was rarer than gold. The rancher listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his heart unsettled. That night, as the widow and her child slept near the fire, the rancher lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling beams above. He could hear the faint rhythm of the baby's breath, a sound both fragile and stubborn. It struck him with a force stronger than gunfire. The West had taken nearly everything from him. Yet here, within his walls, lay a reminder that life could still endure. And with that thought came a question he could not escape. Was this woman's plea at his door a chance to save them, or a chance to save himself? Morning came with the pale light of dawn spilling across the prairie. The widow rose quietly, tending to her baby while the rancher prepared the horses outside. He moved with his usual precision, every task deliberate, but his mind wandered back to the night before. It had been years since another soul had shared his roof, and the weight of it pressed against him like an unfamiliar burden. Yet when he returned to find the widow humming softly to her child, the sound filled his cabin with something he had not felt in a long time: warmth. The townsfolk soon caught wind of her presence. By midday, whispers ran through the saloon like wildfire. Some mocked the rancher for taking in a stranger, calling him a fool for letting sentiment cloud his judgment. Others, hardened by loss and mistrust, muttered that a woman cast out by her own kin must be carrying a curse. In the Wild West, reputation was as dangerous as a revolver, and the rancher knew the eyes of the town would soon turn toward him with suspicion. Still, he did not send her away. The widow, sensing his unease, offered to leave, her voice steady though her hands trembled. She had grown accustomed to rejection, to doors slammed in her face, and she would not hold it against him if he chose the same path. But the rancher, surprising even himself, shook his head. "You stay," he muttered, his tone gruff but resolute. The words were few, yet they carried a weight far heavier than he realized. For in that moment, he had not only offered shelter, he had chosen to defy the loneliness that had ruled his life for so long. As days passed, an unspoken rhythm settled into the ranch. The widow cooked simple meals, her presence bringing life to a home that had long stood silent. The baby's laughter echoed faintly through the halls, its small voice chasing away shadows that had lingered too long. The rancher found himself watching quietly, caught between disbelief and wonder, as though his own home had transformed before his eyes. Yet beneath it all, a quiet fear gnawed at him, that the world outside would not allow this fragile peace to last. For in the West, kindness often carried a price. A man who opened his door to strangers risked more than his solitude. He risked becoming a target for those who saw mercy as weakness. And though the rancher's hand was steady on his revolver and his aim still true, he knew the battles that lay ahead would not be fought with bullets alone. They would be fought with trust, with courage, and with the willingness to stand against a world that had forgotten the meaning of compassion. The days stretched into weeks, and though the widow and her baby brought warmth to the ranch, the outside world pressed closer with each passing sunrise. Rumors traveled faster than the wind on the prairie. Some townsfolk whispered that the rancher had taken pity on a desperate woman, while others, darker in their judgments, claimed he had invited danger into his home. In the West, gossip often struck harder than bullets, and it wasn't long before strangers began to linger near his land, watching, measuring, waiting for weakness to reveal itself. The widow carried herself with quiet strength, but the scars of rejection still weighed heavily on her shoulders. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she confessed her fear to the rancher. She worried that her presence had brought shame upon him, that the town's cold stares and cruel whispers were blades sharpened against his name. The rancher listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the fire, and when she finished, he simply said, "I've lived too long with silence. Let them talk." His voice was steady, not for her sake, but for his own, as though he too had discovered something worth standing for. But the West was merciless, and kindness was often mistaken for weakness. A band of drifters arrived in town, men with no loyalty but to their own hunger. They heard the whispers, saw the widow, and smelled opportunity. To them, the lonely rancher's compassion was not an act of courage. It was an open door to take whatever they pleased. Their eyes followed the woman with cruel intent, their laughter curling through the streets like smoke. until even the sheriff warned the rancher that trouble was coming. The rancher was no stranger to trouble. He had faced storms that ripped his fences to shreds, droughts that starved his cattle, and men who thought themselves wolves only to learn too late what it meant to meet steel. Yet this time was different. This time, the danger wasn't only his to bear. The widow and her child were now part of his home, their lives tangled with his own, and the thought of losing them struck him with a fear sharper than any blade. It was no longer a question of survival, but of protection. That night, as the widow tucked her baby beneath a quilt patched with wear, the rancher sat at the table cleaning his revolver, the firelight catching the edge of steel. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a fire he had not felt in years. He was ready to defend them, not because they had asked, but because they had given him something he thought was lost forever, a reason to fight for more than himself. The first confrontation came at dawn. The drifters, 3 men hardened by dust and greed, rode onto the ranch with the kind of arrogance born from lawless lives. Their boots hit the dirt with heavy thuds, their smirks dripping with mockery as they called for the widow to come out. The rancher stepped forward, his frame steady, his revolver resting at his hip, his eyes unblinking. He did not shout, nor did he threaten. He simply stood, a wall of silence between the danger and those under his roof. The leader of the drifters sneered, circling like a vulture, spitting words meant to provoke. "You think you can play hero, old man? Taking in strays as if the West doesn't chew them up and spit them out." His laughter cracked through the morning air, but the rancher did not move. His hand never twitched toward his gun, yet the weight of his presence was heavier than bullets. The silence that followed was sharper than steel, and for a moment, even the drifters felt it pressing against their skin. Inside the cabin, the widow held her baby close, her heart pounding. She had lived through rejection, cruelty, and hunger, but never had she seen someone stand so firmly on her behalf. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from something far deeper, hope. In that moment, she realized the rancher's kindness was not born from pity, but from a strength few men carried, a strength carved by loneliness and tempered by loss. He had chosen her and her child, not as burdens, but as part of the life he was willing to defend. The standoff stretched until the sun climbed higher, each second dragging like an eternity. Finally, the rancher spoke, his voice low and steady. "This land is mine. My door is mine, and no one enters unless I say so." The words carried no flourish, no bravado, but they landed heavier than gunfire. The drifters shifted uneasily, muttering curses under their breath, but they did not draw. Something in his tone told them that if they crossed him, they would not walk away. They retreated that morning, but the widow knew it was not the end. Trouble in the West never disappeared. It circled like a hawk, waiting for weakness. Yet as she watched the rancher return to his work, calm as if nothing had passed, she felt a strength rise within her too. Perhaps for the first time since she had been cast out, she was no longer merely surviving. Perhaps she and her baby had finally found a place where they could belong. The drifters' retreat left behind a silence that clung heavier than their threats. The rancher returned to his chores as if nothing had happened, his boots crunching through the dust, his hands steady on the reins of the cattle. But the widow could not shake the image of those men. Their hungry eyes, their cruel grins, burned into her memory. She knew they would return, not because of need, but because cruelty was a hunger that never stayed quiet for long. Every creak of the windmill, every howl of the coyotes after dusk, made her clutch her child tighter, fearing it was only a matter of time before the ranch would be tested again. The townsfolk, too, began to stir with unease. Some admired the rancher for standing firm, whispering that perhaps he was not as cold as they once believed. Others sneered behind closed doors, predicting his downfall. "A man who opens his door," they said, "is a man who digs his grave." The widow heard these words when she went into town for flour, felt the weight of their stares on her back, as if she were a curse given human form. Yet when she returned to the ranch, the sound of her baby's laughter and the rancher's quiet nod were enough to remind her that here, she was no longer cast out. The baby grew stronger in those days, its small cries filling the once hollow walls with life. The rancher, though he never said much, found himself drawn to the sound, lingering in the doorway when the widow sang softly, The baby's tiny fingers curled around her hand. He did not admit it aloud, but each note of her lullabies cut through the years of silence he had built around himself. For so long, he had believed that loneliness was his only shield. Now, for the first time, he questioned whether it had been a prison instead. But nights on the frontier were never kind. The drifters returned in the dark, their shadows stretching long under the pale glow of the moon. This time, they did not come to taunt, they came to strike. The crunch of hooves broke the stillness. The glint of steel caught the firelight. The rancher, sitting at his table, rose without a word. His revolver was already waiting, but more than his gun, it was the resolve in his eyes that burned steady. He knew this fight was no longer about land or pride. It was about the widow who had whispered for mercy, the baby whose breath carried through the walls, and the fragile warmth that had finally returned to his home. The widow stood frozen, her child clutched against her chest, as the first knock echoed through the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. She turned to the rancher, her lips trembling, but he only gave her a look, calm and unwavering. For the first time since her exile, she realized she was no longer begging for protection. She was standing in a home defended not by pity, but by choice. And in that moment, the frontier felt less cruel, as though the vast, merciless land had finally allowed her a place to belong. The night erupted into violence. The drifters forced their way through the gate, shouting threats that split the silence of the plains. The cattle scattered, the horses reared, and the ranch became a battlefield under the cold glow of the stars. The rancher stepped forward, revolver drawn, his body steady as stone. He did not shout, did not boast. His silence was more terrifying than their fury. When the first shot rang out, the echo carried across the prairie like thunder. The widow crouched low inside the cabin, pressing her baby close, her heart pounding with every crack of gunfire. Each sound tore through her nerves, but she knew she could not give in to fear. This ranch had given her more than shelter. It had given her hope, and she refused to let it be taken. She whispered prayers into the baby's hair, her voice shaking, begging for dawn to come quickly, for the light to cut through the darkness that pressed so mercilessly against their door. Outside, the fight raged. The drifters, reckless and hungry, underestimated the man they faced. Years of solitude had sharpened the rancher's resolve like iron against stone. Every movement was deliberate, every shot measured, each step a reminder that this was his land, his home, and he would not surrender it. Yet with every moment, the risk grew greater. He knew one mistake could mean not only his life, but the lives of the woman and child who had trusted him. The final moments came swiftly. Smoke curled in the air, the scent of gunpowder mixing with the dried dust of the earth. The last drifter, wounded and gasping, staggered back toward the gate. His curses faded into the night as he stumbled into the darkness, leaving behind only silence. The rancher stood tall, his revolver still smoking, his chest heaving with breath, but his eyes steady. The fight was over, but the weight of it lingered heavy in the air, as though the land itself had witnessed what had been carved into its soil. When he returned inside, the widow looked up at him, her eyes wide with both fear and awe. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, fragile yet alive. The rancher lowered his head, setting the revolver on the table, and in that instant, the walls of silence he had carried for years finally cracked. He had not just defended a home. He had defended a family, and though he would never say the word aloud, he knew that was what they had become. The days that followed the attack carried a stillness unlike any the ranch had ever known. The drifters did not return, and though the town buzzed with whispers, none dared confront the rancher face to face. Some called him a fool for risking his life over a widow and a child. Others muttered that perhaps he had finally gone soft. But beneath their scorn lay a quiet respect, for men in the West understood one truth above all others. A man who defends what is his, no matter the cost, is not to be trifled with. Inside the cabin, life began to settle into a fragile rhythm. The widow swept the floors, cooked meals, and mended old quilts while her baby cooed softly in the corner. The rancher, though unchanged in his stoic silence, found himself lingering near them more often than not. He would pause in the doorway to watch the child's laughter, or stand by the window, listening to the widow's soft hum as she worked. These moments were brief, unspoken, but they carried a weight heavier than any words. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. The widow often woke in the night, startled by memories of exile, of doors slammed in her face, of the harsh voices that declared her unworthy of shelter. She feared that this safety could vanish as suddenly as it had arrived, that one day the rancher might decide her presence was a burden too heavy to carry. But each time her fear grew too strong. She remembered the night he stood between her and the drifters, his revolver steady, his silence fierce. That memory became her anchor, reminding her that some men choose loyalty not out of obligation, but out of conviction. The rancher, too, wrestled with his thoughts. He had lived years believing solitude was his only refuge, that building fences high enough to keep the world out was the only way to survive. Yet now, each sunrise brought a sound he had long forgotten, the cry of a child, the whisper of another voice at his table, the faint echo of belonging. These sounds unsettled him, but they also stirred something deeper, something he feared to name. He knew the West was cruel, and he wondered how long such fragile peace could endure under its sky. One evening, as the fire burned low, the widow looked across the table and whispered, "I never thought I'd find a place again." Her words were soft, almost to herself, but the rancher heard them. He did not reply, for words were not his way. Instead, he reached across the table and pushed the last piece of bread toward her. It was a simple gesture, but in the harsh language of the frontier, it spoke louder than vows. It said, "You belong here now." Autumn crept slowly across the prairie, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch, once silent as stone, now carried the hum of daily life. The baby had begun to crawl, filling the cabin with bursts of laughter that startled even the horses outside. The widow's presence softened the edges of the home, turning a place once haunted by silence into something alive. For the first time in years, the rancher found himself waking each morning not to the ache of loneliness, but to the sound of life stirring within his walls. But peace in the West was never without its price. News of the drifters' defeat spread, twisting into tales far grander than the truth. Some claimed the rancher had taken on an entire gang alone. Others said he had struck a bargain with death itself. These stories attracted the wrong kind of attention. Men who saw the ranch not as a place of refuge, but as a challenge waiting to be conquered. The rancher knew it was only a matter of time before the horizon brought new threats. The widow sensed his unease. She watched him ride the fences at dusk, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the revolver at his side. She longed to ask what weighed on him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she worked harder to keep the home warm, the meals ready, the babies safe. Her silence was not ignorance. It was trust. She knew he carried the burden of protection, and she chose instead to carry the burden of care. One evening, as the wind swept cold through the plains, the rancher returned from the fields to find a widow rocking her child near the fire. The glow lit her face with a quiet strength, and for a moment, he simply stood there, his chest tightening with something he could not name. The years of emptiness that had defined him seemed to crumble, replaced by a weight he did not fear. It was not loneliness that filled his cabin now. It was responsibility, and with it, a strange, unspoken sense of belonging. The rancher knew the West would test them again, perhaps sooner than either wished. But as he watched the widow's eyes meet his across the firelight, he realized something no bullet or storm could strip from him. He was no longer standing alone. And in a land where solitude had been his only weapon, the discovery of family, even one pieced together by loss, was the greatest strength he had ever known. Winter descended upon the plains with a merciless hand. Snow swept across the prairie, covering fences and burying trails until the land seemed endless and white. The ranch, once a fortress of solitude, now stood as a fragile beacon of warmth against the cold. Inside, the widow wrapped her child in quilts patched with care, while the rancher stoked the fire higher, determined to keep the frost from claiming what he had sworn to protect. The storm outside roared, but within the cabin, a quiet resilience took root. The townsfolk, however, did not forget. Some pitied the rancher, believing he had chained himself to a burden that would break him before spring. Others envied the life within his cabin, whispering that perhaps he had found something worth more than cattle or land. Yet no matter what they thought, none dared cross his threshold again. The story of the drifters lingered like smoke, and though their bodies had not been buried on his land, the legend of his defiance had. As the days grew shorter, the widow began to share more of her past. By the firelight, her voice carried soft but steady, telling of the husband she had lost, of the betrayal of kin who turned her away, of the long nights spent praying her baby would see another dawn. The rancher listened, his face unreadable, but inside her words cut deep. He knew the taste of loss, the weight of abandonment, the way silence could become both a shield and a curse. In her story, he found pieces of his own, stitched together by grief and survival. The baby grew stronger, even as the storm raged. His laughter rang like a bell through the cabin, piercing the walls of silence that had stood for years. The rancher, hardened by decades of solitude, found himself smiling at the sound without meaning to. It was a small thing, almost unnoticeable, but the widow saw it. And in that moment, she knew the ranch was no longer just shelter. It was a home, one that her child had already claimed as his own. Yet the West was not kind enough to allow peace to last. One evening, as the snow eased and the stars broke through the clouds, the rancher saw figures moving against the horizon. They were not the drifters who had fled months before, but strangers, drawn perhaps by the whispers of a rancher who had stood his ground. Trouble was stirring again, and the land, as always, demanded a price for the life it allowed. The strangers arrived at dawn, their horses steaming in the frost, their faces hidden beneath wide hats and scarves. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who believed no door could withstand their knock. The rancher stepped outside before they could dismount, his boots crunching through the snow, his revolver resting calm at his side. The widow watched from the window, her child in her arms, her breath caught between fear and faith. She had seen him stand before, but each test felt heavier than the last, each silence sharper than steel. The men spoke of supplies, of shelter, of taking what they needed from a land too harsh to care who lived or died. Their words were coded in civility, but their eyes told the truth. They were predators circling prey. The rancher said little, his voice steady as he warned them that his land was not theirs to claim. Behind him, the cabin glowed with the fire of family, and he knew he was no longer defending only himself. What followed was not swift, nor was it loud. It was a standoff written in silence, the kind of silence that decides fates in the West. The strangers, sensing his resolve, shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had expected fear, perhaps even surrender, but what they met instead was a man whose loneliness had been reforged into loyalty, whose home was guarded not by walls, but by purpose. And in that silence, they chose to turn away, muttering curses that melted into the snow as they rode back toward the horizon. When the rancher stepped back inside, the widow met his eyes. No words passed between them, but none were needed. In the firelight, with the baby's laughter filling the room, they both understood what had been forged in the crucible of hardship. The West could test them, break them, or strip them bare, but within these walls they had built something stronger than fear, something worth standing for, again and again, no matter what the horizon carried. And so the lonely rancher's story shifted. He was no longer the man spoken of only in whispers, the figure of solitude behind high fences. He became something else entirely, a guardian, a companion, a symbol of the fragile but unyielding truth that even in the cruelest corners of the West, kindness could carve out a home. And though the land would never cease its trials, the widow's plea at his door had already changed him forever. In the end, the story of the widow, her child, and the lonely rancher was never about bullets fired in the night or whispers of danger across the plains. It was about the moment when a door opened, when one act of mercy redefined two broken lives. In a land where survival was often measured by strength alone, this tale reminds us that true strength sometimes lies in the courage to care, in the choice to let others in when the world has cast them out. The rancher's silence, once his armor, became the ground on which hope was rebuilt. By offering shelter, he did more than give a roof against the storm. He gave belonging to those who had none. The widow, once burdened by rejection, discovered that even the harshest soil could allow roots to grow again. And the child, whose cries first pierced the walls of solitude, became the living proof that life could endure even in the most merciless corners of the West. What this story carves into our memory is simple yet unforgettable. Mercy is not weakness, and solitude is not destiny. One whisper at a door, "Please take us in," can echo louder than 1,000 gunshots. It can transform exile into family, silence into laughter, and fear into the unshakable will to protect. In a world built on fences, both of wood and of the heart, this tale asks us to remember the power of opening gates instead of raising walls. The Wild West teaches us that storms, enemies, and loss will always come. But when kindness dares to take root, it can withstand more than droughts and bullets. It can change the shape of destiny itself. The rancher did not set out to become a guardian or a father figure. Yet the plea of a widow turned his loneliness into purpose, and his house into a home. That is the lesson that endures. No one is too broken to be needed, and no heart is too cold to be thawed. If this story touched you, let your thoughts be heard. Share in the comments what it made you feel, what it made you remember. And if you wish to keep walking through these unforgettable tales of the West, where every whisper carries the weight of a legend, subscribe and like this video, so that you'll always be part of the firelight where stories such as these are told.